despite the privatization of discos, the biggest investors in the electricity sector were states. They're buying transformers, they're building feeders. These are things that they buy, build, and then the disco says you have to donate it to me. I can tell you for free, states have built injection stations, which they will donate. You have entities like NDDC, it's under 9 states. So, okay, just do one injection station. Some of these things are not there. So I think discos have been mollycoddled to a point where there's been no serious attempt for them to reimagine their business. That's it. Because I can't understand why metering is the cash box of the sector. But ask yourself, how many discos are really taking the pains to say, okay, we're going to really meet our customers in a manner that is aggressive and we can collect.
Hello everyone, Ugodre here, and you're welcome to Talknomics. Talknomics, of course, is the show where we dissect business, economic, and financial issues in Nigeria and as they affect Nigerian businesses and Nigerian people. And today I have, of course, another very special guest. This time around, somebody who I'm very fond of, a very good friend of mine, and somebody who is very, very vast in this subject that we are about to delve into. We're going to be talking about electricity. A lot of you have been asking me, when am I going to go into electricity? I've been running away from this sector for a bit. But anyway, at some point, I guess I had to, we have to talk about power. And so here we are talking about the power sector. And I have none other than Odion Omonfoman, the CEO of New Hampshire Capital. Chief Odion.
Thank you for having me. I finally get to arrive into your kingdom.
Yes.
Well done,
The kingdom of nairametrics. Good to have you, man. How have you been?
Yeah. Good. We're good.
All right. So I know you're a busy person. Anybody who is sitting on this chair is typically a very, very busy guy. We know it's not easy getting you, out of your very busy schedule to come here and talk to Nigerians about the sector. So let's talk electricity. And I would want to start from the top because there's a lot of people really don't know. Especially for some of us that have been insiders. You've been an outsider, insider as well. So at least you have various lenses that you can look at this from. But let's go back to privatization. Back in November 2013, when the privatization actually went live with the acquisition of handover of the discos to private sector participants and Gencos. It's roughly 12 years now or thereabouts.
Yeah.
And if you ask a lot of Nigerians, they will tell you it hasn't really worked. So if we were to believe some of what they've said, what went wrong?
Okay, that's a question I think have been answered a lot of times. But what went wrong is the answers are usually different when you speak to different parties. Mm-hmm. But from my perspective, 4 things went wrong. One is that the reforms were poorly implemented. They had a very bad market model that I don't think Nigeria was ripe for the market model that privatization or the reforms had tried to push. In other words, a wholesale privatization of the generation and distribution sector weren't ripe for it at the time that reform was carried out. They weren't ripe for it. That's one. The second was lack of capital. Incidentally, the reforms were meant to bring in private sector capital into the business. On the generation side, that has happened. I mean, we must see what it is. On the generation side, we've seen the likes of North-South Power, Mainstream, Transcorp, even the Sahara Group bringing capital to upscale and bring back the generation assets that were procured. And we've seen IPPs as well as Zoras and Co bringing capital. But on the transmission and distribution side, we've not seen that capital into a particularly private sector capital into it. One can say there are other factors that have led to that lack of capital. The third factor is poor or ineffective regulations. You could say number two is as a result of number 3. and perhaps number four being political interference in the whole system. So effectively, you have regulators who, first of all, I mean, when privatization happened, we had a regulator who was just barely 2 years in place, was still trying to understand a market-based regulation, how it worked. And then that exited a new set. We had an administrator in place for quite a while before you then had substantive regulators. And in between that time, certain regulations market-based regulations should have happened that didn't happen, and made the whole the reform process even worse, or rather the commercials for the private sector investment. And then political capital, or rather political interference, was pretty much underlying the ineffectual regulations. So you have a regulation that says tariff you have the annual reviews and biannual reviews of tariffs. And for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, you didn't have any such reviews. In fact, anytime the regulator finally tried to implement such tariff increments, adjustments, it was made firstly by political, the guys on the political side who said, look, you're going to distort, you're going to cause us lose the election, all that, and we're going to do subsidy. So we're now in a mess where the subsidy in the sector is perhaps bigger than whatever capital has come into the sector. So for me, those are the four main things. Of course, there are other factors as well, but I would say those are the four headline items that has put the sector in the position where it is today.
All right, good point. We'll talk about tariffs at some point, on the program, but there's another. Maybe I can add this as number 5. I think some have also alluded to the Act, the Electricity Act, the Power Sector Reform Act at the time. Some have said, look, maybe perhaps we should have improved on it. And even though we've now seen a new Electricity Act, perhaps I guess the point was the Electricity Act should have happened earlier than it did. But we do have the new Electricity Act now, and signed by Tinubu administration. I think that's one of the first piece of legislation that he did sign. Has that changed anything, or do you think that?
Yes, I was privileged to be part of those who advocated for the EPSRA 2005 to be amended or a wholesale repeal of it, because the EPSRA, which is the Electric Power Sector Reform Act 2005, was more of a reform bill. You'd reform the sector, whether for good or for bad. It was time to look at it from a market-based legal structure. So EPSRA at the time, EPSRA post-privatization, didn't meet the standards. The second thing was that EPSRA was actually created a central electricity market, which is not. Electricity is a concurrent matter. It's always been. For some reason,
when you say central electricity market, how do you mean?
They've domiciled electricity regulations, lawmaking at the federal level. So effectively, electricity was treated like an exclusive matter wholly for the federal government, whereas it was and has always been on the concurrent legislative list. So effectively, state governments, take for instance the current president, in his first 1 year as Lagos state government, he tried to do electricity and said, look, Lagos must have his electricity market. And the federal government, based on their understanding of the constitution at the time, felt, look, anything electricity is federal government. So whatever you do, you must come bow to the federal government. And you find out that states like Lagos, Rivers, Akwa Ibom, who had built power plants ready to deliver, were forced to put these power plants on the national grid. And then the story going thereafter, because you had NEPA. So the EPSRA was focused on NEPA, a reform of NEPA, not necessarily the power sector. So after post-privatization, you then had private sector people come in. It was very clear that EPSRA was never going to work at the end of the day. So the Electricity Act was more or less, again, strengthening the ability of the central regulator to do a bit of more work, trying to remove some of the political interference, and then, more importantly, decentralizing power as in line with the Constitution. Effectively, states could now and can now make laws to regulate intrastate electricity affairs between their states. And that for me is the game changer in the whole Electricity Act. There are some very nice provisions there, but for me, the biggest game changer is the fact that states who actually are where the last mile value chain is are now able to play either from a legal framework, a regulatory framework, or even policy framework to improve power sector within their space. So, and that will take a while. Let me just speak to it. People think that this should be overnight. It takes a while to get to a steady state of, okay, we are now reaping the benefits of the Electricity Act. We will reap it because you're going to see some states, and I can already tell you some states are already moving in very fast. Some states have not started the process, but over time, you're going to see the benefits of the Electricity Act. And I think the current president, His Excellency President Tinubu, did the right thing by signing that act within 8 days of his swearing.
Good point. I'm just curious to know exactly, or maybe I just want specifics. What are the states going to do differently? Because at the end of the day, the same power that is being generated would have to be fed through the grid. It's not like we'll have new grids, right? So it's still the existing grid that we have, except, perhaps maybe are they looking at modular grids where you have smaller grids serving smaller communities, and we all know what that means for pricing. So what exactly is the state going to do? Because some have also accused the state of, or some have, maybe let me use the word accuse. So suggested, look, this is just a new round of bureaucracy. This is a source for states to probably start to charge license fees without necessarily encouraging investment in that sector. At the end of the day, this is still all the same politics that we saw in the federal. They were trying to domesticate in the subnational. What do you say? Okay,
the first things first is that the biggest game changer is that the state legislature can make laws for electricity that fit the terrain of that state, the peculiar issues. Look, electricity issues are providing power in Borno. The issues you face there would be totally different from what you'd face in Bayelsa. Terrain is different, geography, culture, all that. Right? So you're able to make very specific laws or legal framework that will at least improve electricity situation within your state. Most of the time, people focus on generation from the national grid feeding in. That's the system we've all known. We've all grown up.
Yeah.
But again, I take your mind back to what Lagos tried to do in 1999, 2000. We're going to put a badge somewhere at Ikorodu area and put power in. Akwa Ibom built the Ibom power plants to put power in. Rivers built 3 IPPs, which incidentally are now 70% run by private sector. But the idea was we're going to use our gas resources to power our people. And they had also built the transmission. Now, that was then when states were still very buoyant in terms of capital. What I see now is that states are now looking at creating that environment for indigenous investors within their states and even communities and private sector to participate in generating and delivering power to last mile customers. Besides that, one of the things that people didn't know or people couldn't understand is, despite the privatization of discos, the biggest investors in the electricity sector were states. They're buying transformers, they're building feeders. These are things that they buy, build, and then disco says you have to donate it to me. I can tell you for free, states have built injection stations, which they will donate. You have entities like NDDC, it's under 9 states. So, okay, just do one injection station. Some of these things are not there. NDPHC is owned by the states. At least is a federation entity. They've made investments across the value chain without any commercial. So you find out that states have been, as far as I'm concerned, one of the largest investors, even in the discos, without any such recognition. But now that investment under their own legal framework, policy framework, regulatory framework, they're able to now channel it properly to make sure access to electricity is improved. Right? Again, some states would be fast about this. They will know what to do. Some states would perhaps take their time to understand, as we're seeing. But eventually, nobody can look at the federal government and say, well, you didn't give me power. You will be looking at your state government to say, I don't have power. It's because maybe you've not done the right thing or put in place a legal structure to make it happen. So that changes, for me, the equation as to how people then look at service delivery in the power sector. The last thing is that you have discos operating in multiple markets. Each time you have a problem, prior to the Electricity Act, people run to Abuja to talk to somebody in NEC. And I mean, the thing is happening in one village that maybe the guy they've gone to report to is not aware. So you find out these customer issues are hardly ever dealt with.
Yeah.
But now you're talking to the state. It's talking to somebody who knows the area, who is able to tell the disco based on state laws, you're supposed to do this. So for me, those are some of the game changers: better service delivery, more investment from the private sector, more involvement of the state in how electricity matters are dealt with within the state. And then there's a lot more stakeholder engagement at community, individual levels to make sure the sector is improved. So that for me are some of the points.
All right. So still on this matter, I think I saw a circular recently from Lagos State. We've seen a lot of work being done across state. There's Ekiti, there's Akwa Ibom. Are there any specific states that you've looked at their state electricity laws and how they are implementing the takeover of regulation of their states that perhaps that caught your attention in a positive way?
A fantastic question. By the way, form of disclosure, I'm the lead consultant in Nigerian Governors Forum on electricity matters.
Okay.
And we developed a template electricity bill for states, for subnationals. A lot of the subnationals have gone ahead to adopt that template. Some have adapted it to fit their peculiar policy direction that they want to take, while some have also gone ahead to do their own wholesale with working with consultants. But long and short, one of the beauty of what we're seeing is you now have laws that people in the state sat down to say, this is how we want our electricity sector to work. It's not some people sitting in Abuja to come up with the Electricity Act or the EPSRA and then foisting it on the state. People have sat down to say, okay, this is our peculiar situation in this state. This is how we want to solve it. That's the first one. So you have laws that are very interesting. Some laws make provision for open access. Some laws have talked about new models, new commercial models that from a central law you will not have had. Some laws are talking about retail services. Some laws are talking about creating electricity cooperatives with the right framework. Some laws are talking about even how to use renewable energy to fast track their growth. And then in terms of the implementation, you're also seeing various ideas, policy directions, ideas, which for me is beautiful because now you're not relying on 7 people sitting somewhere in Abuja in an office called NEC headquarters, telling you how regulation should be formed, having stakeholder engagement meetings, and maybe 1 or 2 people, they just call people. Let me not go there. Long and short is you have more people within the state coming together to put policy, legal structures in place that will work for them. So in terms of what I see a number of states doing, Lagos has a very interesting perspective how they want to create the Lagos State electricity market. Well, I would allow Commissioner Abiodun and his team to speak to it. But what I see is that long and short, what the states are looking at, what Lagos State is looking at in terms of end game is no different from what Ekiti is looking at. It's no different from what Enugu is looking at or Edo. What they've done is to look at their peculiar situations. They say, okay, if we do policy in this direction, this is the end.
But I'm just curious, what sort of market dynamics are they bringing? What are they going to do?
They're not doing anything other than creating an environment where more investors, more competition coming.
Didn't that environment exist?
No, it didn't exist because from day one, if you wanted to be a generator, you had to go to NEC, and then there's the whole issues about embeds, TCN and co. You didn't have a local grid to inject in it. And if you wanted to do embedded, you already know how it worked. You had to go to the disco and beg and neck. In fact, there was one engagement that I saw in NEC where a whole village, they don't have electricity for decades. They wanted to do an IED and they were the chiefs and co. They were summoned to Abuja.
What's IED?
IED, and the Independent Electricity Distribution Network.
Okay, yeah.
And they were summoned to Abuja. And I was just scratching my head. These are people that they've not had electricity for years. But somebody in Abuja who has never been to the village is asking them, why do you want electricity? Why do you want to have an idea? Why do you want to bypass your disco? That in this instance won't happen because clearly if an area is underserved or unserved, it behoves on the state to say, look, I want this area served and how it wants to go about it. It will put it out in regulation. That works. One of the biggest fears under state electricity markets subnational electricity market is that the discos seem to be worried that their powers or they will lose a lot of their franchise areas. Yes and no. I say this to them because successful discos will continue to remain the dominant distribution service providers in these markets based on their spread. But there are people that are underserved or unserved first, and then even with your wide network, how do you optimize it? For them to do so now, NEC maybe has to generate a regulation that talks about optimizing their network. In this case, it's the state working with the state to say, okay, how do you optimize it? I know some discos who say, okay, we have 33 kV lines crisscrossing the state. We're going to be like a mid-tier transmission company. So we're going to open up those lines so people can put power. And then on the retail side, retail service providers can deliver the power. We just bulk sell power. We provide transmission infrastructure for you guys, and you guys pay us the throughput. It doesn't mean that they've stopped being the dominant players. The point is subnational electricity markets allow distribution entities to rethink, to reimagine their business and service delivery options. I mean, but it also creates competition for them as well, because now if they're not providing service, then the state has the ability to say, okay, you're now under a licensing regulation. We can do whatever we want to do with the license at the right time because you're not meeting service.
I mean, I thought distribution companies would always tell you the problem hasn't really been distribution. It's always been transmission and being able to essentially get power and then distribute to their customers. Yes, they do have distribution issues, but being able to, get the right power transmitted to them has always been a challenge. So how do you circumvent that?
So here's the thing, right? I'm full disclosure again. I know I'm trying to divorce the fact that I'm trying to. I just want to play the fact that you're neutral. So I'm going to say this: if you speak to the TC and the transmission company, they'll tell you discos are the problem.
So there's always that blame game.
Yes, there's always that blame game, and quite frankly, it's a blame game that, if you really look at it, the discos at the end of the day control the cash flow of the industry. And they deliver that power that is transmitted to the last mile customer. If there are challenges along that two functions, delivering the power and collecting the cash, the upstream side will not work. Effectively. So you might say, yes, they don't deliver the power to the areas we want it, or they don't deliver enough power. But even the power that they delivered, how efficiently have you delivered to the last mile customer? How efficiently have you collected from that customer? That's where the gap is. I mean, you cannot fault the Gencos. The Gencos, as far as I'm concerned, they're the biggest losers in this game because they've done the right investments.
And they're operating under capacity because of all this.
Yes. Very shockingly, part of my role as a consultant, I had to visit a number of TCN infrastructure. And one of the things that struck me was there's a lot of stranded transmission capacity in some of these places. Even in these urban Lagos that we're crying that we don't have power. So you then start to scratch your head. If there's so much power somewhere, why are we not getting it downstream? So yes, the disco can always claim TCN is a problem, but I think the first things first is they are not obligated to always buy 100% from the national grid. They too can do their local captive power. Not even captive, their own embedded power.
Yeah.
And that's where state electricity markets or state regulations come in to say, look, we don't need to be connected to the national.
Yeah.
Somebody can put his 10 megawatts, 5 megawatts, 2 megawatts, buy from the person.
So why hasn't that worked though? Why are states not allowing this?
Who says states aren't allowing?
I mean, discourse. I beg your pardon.
Yeah, so that's the whole mindset. Again, we've operated 10 years of operating.
Because I would have thought that would have been in their best interest. Because at the end of the day, all they are is retail distributors. So
10 years of operating under a system that didn't impose on you didn't impose on you a service delivery obligation, firm service delivery obligation. So, for instance, NERC, in fairness to NERC, they've come up with embedded generation policy. How many discos took that up? You even have eligible customers. But the point is, for some very weird reason, I think there's a perverse incentive for discos, and not all discos, for majority of discos not to provide service in a manner that that is fairly reliable. And I can understand that from their perspective. I mean, they'll tell you their technical losses. They'll tell you their collection losses. They'll tell you their commercial losses. They have not been able to muster the right investment to address these losses. So if you go and do embedded power, you're supplying them, and then guess what? That area is not fully metered. The feeder system is poor. They lose 35% of the power that you deliver to them, or they can't collect. Then it puts them in a bigger hole. So rather than avoid that hole, to avoid that hole, they rather not just do anything. Because guess what? They still get to bill the customer. And if all else fails, the federal government gets to help them out with their projects. So I think discos have been mollycoddled to a point where there's been no serious attempt for them to reimagine their business. That's it. Because I can't understand why metering is the cash box of the sector. But ask yourself, how many discos are really taking the pains to say, okay, we're going to really meter our customers in a manner that is aggressive and we can collect. The meter asset provider scheme wasn't an idea of the discos. It was, again, an idea I worked on, and the regulator picked it up. And then we then segued into the NMMP, National Mass Metering, and we're now doing the Presidential Metering Initiative. We're doing the World Bank funded metering initiative. These are monies that the disco on their own did not, or structures that the discos on their own didn't say, okay, we're going to do this. These are third-party interventions into their business.
But even that hasn't worked either, anyways.
It's working, but it's just that, again, it's been on for years. The challenge of if you meter an area, then you finally, true losses finally hit you. So right now, you can afford to say, well, this area is not fully metered, so we don't do it. There's a bit of, we're not going to provide service there because it works for them.
Yeah.
Because beyond meters, the actual infrastructure then gets called into question. For instance, what's the reliability of distribution station substations there? If we then
but does this really matter to metering? I mean, at the end of the day,
it matters to metering. Now, let me tell you why metering is one subset of improving the sector, right? So a lot of people have gone to acquire meters because they really are tired of estimated billing. They're tired of estimated billing in the sense where they know they've been out of supply for weeks, months, and then they get bills.
We understand all that.
Right? So people have rushed to get meters. But even at that, you've not seen discos rush to say, okay, we're going to blanket an area with meters, whether customers are buying or we use our internally generated funds to buy. They've been typically aloof to say, okay, we're not, until federal government comes up with its own metering plan, we're just going to keep complaining that we're unable to collect. The ATC is high because we can't collect and cool. Take, for instance, a low-hanging fruit, metering of your distribution substations, so even monitor your energy. How many discos have 100% DT metering? They actually have to be forced by the regulators to go and meter your DTs. Because once they meter the DTs, there's more transparency of data. People then know, okay, this is actually your supply situation.
So the interesting thing is that I've had a lot of experience in this as well. And so let me throw this back at you. So, I mean, you know very well I worked in a distribution company where we championed 100% DT metering. It was achieved. We were one of the first to champion 100% feeder metering. It was achieved. We also were one of the first to meter an entire area and give them 24/7 power.
Perfect.
Now, even after doing all that, we still recorded losses within some of these areas. I mean, I agree, not as wide as in other areas. So if you're other discos and you're seeing that a lot of this CapEx investment has been done by a much profitable disco or a disco that is a lot more viable, however, they still face the same sector challenges that others have faced. What incentives do you have to want to do the same thing? I mean, will your investors look at this and say, look, I've seen this other disco. They've done everything that you said we want to do. They've metered all their DTs. They've metered all their feeders. They even have an entire area they've cordoned off and metered and given power. But they are still recording losses.
It's a fantastic question. That's the first reason why the EPSRA was updated to support the new commercial model, new market structure. Because when you meter an area, two things happen. First of all, you have some level of revenue drop in the sense that people are more conscious of what they consume.
Correct.
So rather than put on everything, they're very conscious. The other thing is that you also expect that tariffs would reflect that investment. It will be part of your regulated asset base, which you and I know still hasn't happened. So you already have that shortfall from that perspective, first of all. Then the other one is you don't have a situation where people literally are criminally minded. Now, electricity theft is a local affair. But you have a situation whereby the local government, when I mean local government, the state itself is unable to weigh in. So that's why EPSA, when you bring somebody's caught, bypassing meters or whatever, you didn't really have local laws or regulations against such. It was all about what the federal, and then to do other prosecution, I think it was a waste of time for people. But one of the things about state electricity laws is that they've domesticated electricity theft laws. I mean, it's now very robust in most of the laws I've seen. So you find out you now have a state now involved in making sure that electricity theft, vandalization, all those things are now under state jurisdiction. They're able to address it. They're able to prosecute it. All this could need is to make sure they will help the state to do all that. But so that gap already, that loss is as a result of some of the things I've mentioned. But that shouldn't remove the obligation to say, look, we need to improve our collection. We need to give customers the ability to know what they're consuming.
Yeah.
To the extent that from a regulatory perspective, that's your obligation.
Yeah.
Then you should do it, right? And I like what you said. Now referencing your stint in the utility service. Remember, I said not all discos.
Yeah, you did.
So I know I don't want to be specific in certain discos, but 9 out of 11 discos pretty much did nothing because for some reason there's a perverse incentive not to do anything, knowing fully well that you can't fail.
That's what I'm saying. So I'm not sure whether it's a perverse incentive or whether it's because it's probably not viable for them. They probably think it's not viable for them. That's
okay. If it's not viable,
because they've seen that others are doing it.
If it's not viable, the natural thing to do is to say, okay, can we outsource this service or this area or this whatever?
Didn't they try that? Nope. Some of them tried that.
No. They may have tried it, but the terms that they've offered to willing investors who could have reimagined the business makes you literally scratch your head, and I'm one of them.
Yeah, and I guess this all speaks back to the EPSRA and of course the regulations that were in place at the time, which you spoke to. But let's now even talk about the power sector itself. Is the sector viable? I mean, you're a consultant here, you've dealt with a lot of people on the government and the private sector side. Is it viable today to be a disco, to be a Genco, based on the construct of the sector today?
Okay.
And if yes, how?
It's a yes and a no. And I don't want to prevaricate. Yes, in the sense that, think about it, people are still using energy, including the people that we claim cannot pay. It's some form of energy. Either they are burning petrol, whatever they are using to generate some energy for their businesses. You also realize that there's a huge, so to the extent that they are using and they are consuming energy, they are paying for that energy somewhat, some way. People still buy petrol. They may buy whatever, no matter how high petrol price, people still have to go buy petrol from the petrol station to run their generators or diesel. The second is we're seeing the gas infrastructure expand. And they're expanding to customers who typically are using the gas. They're trying to convert gas to power, which is the power sector. So the gas companies are now going into that space because they see value there, right? And then you then have the solar renewable energy companies who are also going into that space. If it wasn't viable, you won't see that investment. People run away. I mean, think about it.
But we're hearing a lot of renewables that are not profitable at the moment anyway, if it wasn't for subsidy. For some form of subsidy. But there's even the people providing the subsidy, they see viability there. It's not a forever subsidy. It's just to facilitate maybe
that.
Maybe non-monetary viability.
Yes. But the point is, you're seeing that level of investment outside of the typical construct we know, which is the Genco disco construct. Outside of it. And people are throwing in money. So that tells you there is some viability there. On the other hand, the construct that we have makes running a Genco very difficult, very unviable, to the extent that you are stuck with that construct. If you're unable to reimagine your business, then you would struggle. And I tell people this. Let me use Abuja Disco. AEDC covers 4 states. Niger, Kogi, Nasarawa, FCT. And I've said to one of their top management, I said, look, AEDC as a company is not a profitable company because the bulk of your revenues come from FCT. But Maitama Electricity Distribution Company will perhaps be more viable and profitable than Abuja Disco as a group.
Yeah, if you hive it off.
If you hive it off. Because I, as an investor, I don't see any bank in this country that will say Abuja, Maitama Electricity Distribution Company is in the market to raise capital and they will not put capital behind it. Because they say it's juicy. It's a juicy area. So you must reimagine your business. If you run your business flat, we must cross-subsidize. You're going to miss it, which is the mindset. Look at it. They sell the telecoms business. MTN didn't start from we must build cell sites in everywhere. The poor areas and the rich areas. It chose the most profitable sites to start off. So think about it. If MTN, Airtel, Glo, and whoever didn't start, they cherry-picked the areas they wanted to provide service. And it's interesting because electricity, when it started in the 18th century, also cherry-picked. The first guy that had electricity in the house was JP Morgan. Yeah. The big man, New York. And then they started to spread before they now came up with the DCAC model of transmitting electricity. But even at that, it was still the viable areas before they went under. As a matter of fact, in 1948, the US started what you call rural electricity cooperatives so that electricity access in rural areas could be fast-tracked.
What does that mean?
Effectively, communities got together to provide electricity access for themselves because the private sector operators were not really interested in these guys. Today, the US, electricity cooperatives in the US, they provide over 50% of electricity in the US. You can Google that, you can check it. They're very big. So yes, we see all the nice big names, private sector, but the models change. What we fail to do here, what discos I don't think are doing, they're not reimagining their business. They've not reimagined their business. They're still stuck in Genco, Embed, TCN, and then we sell and we must cross-subsidize. And then this is where state electricity laws come in.
Okay.
Under a state market, I mean, take for instance like AEDC. same AEDC. You can then operate and say, okay, we're going to hive off Niger State, maybe create certain SPV structures around it. We're going to maybe bring fence FCT. Or, you can focus on certain markets, knowing fully well that state can license new players to take over the unserved areas. You don't have to do the unserved areas again. It's not your business. But when you keep insisting that these unserved areas are part of your franchise, so you're not able to provide. So if you add them together, you're at a loss.
Yeah.
So I keep saying this, until discos start to reimagine their business, it would be unviable.
But how do you reimagine the business without also reimagining the capital structure of these businesses?
So reimagining the business comes to reimagining the capital, because capital doesn't come first. It is the business that comes first. So once you know what you want to do, you either attract capital, or capital says, okay, maybe I'm not so interested. Can you do it? Do further iteration. So the reimagining comes first, and then capital will ride on it. But if you don't start first and you say, let's bring capital, you're just going to waste that capital. As we've seen from previous government interventions where government has thrown money. One of the other things I would disclose is I was the first administrator of the NEMSF, Nigerian Electricity Market Support Fund. It was a $1 billion fund at the time, 230 billion. And that was capital, hard capital that the CBN threw into this market. But I always protested how that capital came in. That capital came in to pay past obligations. And I said to them, no, you need to restructure this to say, look, put this capital as a reward for people who are able to imagine their business and reward them with that capital. But that's all gone. 230 went in. Under the Buhari administration, you then had what you call the presidential partial PIF or whatever, the partial guarantees or something like that, where it started off with 601 billion, and then 700 billion, then 600 billion additional was thrown in. Nothing. You then had the, you're now having Disrupt, $500 million.
So we're throwing all this capital.
You're throwing capital. Meanwhile, there's a whole 4 trillion, 5 trillion deficit. So you've thrown in all this capital. So that tells you capital is not the problem. The problem simply is that people have discos. I'll put it on discos because I think they're the weakest link. Discos have not sat down to reimagine their business. To say, okay, what's my business model? In the light of all these challenges, how do I reimagine this business to make sure that at least I can survive? But everybody's just chill because guess what? For some weird reason, I also believe that the discos believe they have the upper hand in this game. Nobody can dilute them. Nobody can take the business out of their hands. They run an exclusive franchise area, which is not true. So we might as well sit down and do nothing and we'll still be in charge of this business. That's my own take.
Right, so let's still talk about capital. I mean, we've heard different numbers. Some people have brandished we probably need 30 trillion. Some have said $10 billion, $20 billion in the sector to actually, deliver the sort of power that we're looking for. I don't know. Is this just some people just throwing up numbers?
Yes.
Or is there some sort of?
I think we have we like to throw numbers. Somebody sits down somewhere, 600 million people don't have access to electricity. That number since 2015 has been 600. So let me, no, 80% of Nigerians don't have electricity, have access to electricity. Maybe the number has even worsened because population growth has been rapid. So I think people just throw up numbers. I mean, the last time I heard somebody said we needed $10 billion on an annual basis. The first question I asked is, how do you assess this? What parameters do you use? Maybe they actually do have some basis. But here's what I tell people. You see, we're in Lekki phase 1 now. Some areas to have 24-hour power, all they need is a 13 million naira transformer. That's all they need.
Yeah.
Just to improve the capacity of the existing transformer. That's all they need.
No, but we have to aggregate all these things.
No, we don't have
in general.
So the mistake we also make is this whole, we must centralize Nigeria. Once you say Nigeria is a single unit and you look at power sector, that you will never solve it. Because first of all, when you throw $10 billion, I mean, Nigeria needs $10 billion. The guy you're talking to, maybe in the US or some conference, will look at you and say, okay, How am I going to get back the $10 billion? How do you plan to get back the 10 billion? You must break it down.
But isn't that being done already? Or do you know?
No.
I mean, there are some areas, there are some parts of this country where people have 24/7 power.
Fantastic. And that's the point I'm making to say, if you sold the power sector as a single unit, a Nigerian single unit, it cannot work. And I understand why people do it, because they're still stuck on this national grid structure. So all that money, if you look at it, bulk of it goes to strengthening the national grid, which is funny. As far as I'm concerned, it's funny. You're never going to have a reliable national grid to the extent of how Nigeria is structured as a federation. You're never going to have it. Why don't you look at it from a decentralized perspective? How much does Lagos need to have a reliable grid or reliable power service? How much does Edo State need? Or what does Edo State need to make sure it has some form of reliable service? That's how I think it should be looked at. But to sit somewhere and say, well, Nigeria needs 10 billion, whatever, people are just going to pretty much wonder, okay, how are you going to get it? But like I said, maybe they have a basis, but from where I sit, I think the way I manner, we should look at the small investors. We should look at a lot of low-hanging fruits that can provide communities with 24-hour power. How much would it take to construct a maybe 10 kilometer, 11 kV feeder to a community that has no power for years?
Some discourse will say there's been that level of investment done the distribution side, but still doesn't guarantee power. You've even seen private sector. You've just mentioned. You've seen government as well. Get in there, provide transformer, provide injection substations, provide feeders, and yet, the upstream power that is required to energize those stations are not there.
Upstream power. That's my point.
Yeah, so your point is that reimagining is get an embedded power.
Put something.
But are you going to get it? So I mean, that's just going into different, because discussion too will now be: look, are the embedded guys want to come in? Do they think that this is a viable enough business you want to get into? Because the so-called good areas that you're talking about, where that is juicy, are perhaps sorted out. And so,
are they really sorted out?
I mean,
other than Banana Island, I'm not aware of any other area that enjoys reliable.
Yeah, I mean, we when I was there, I don't know what it's like these days, but I do know pretty well that the likes of Ikeja, GRA, Magodo, and all those areas were one of the first areas that were enjoying 24/7 grid, 100% grid power, and not some of the hybrid. But let's talk about discos again. As we get close to rounding off, I've also heard perhaps discos need to recapitalize at some point, because a lot of them are need to go. Yep. We've seen recapitalization happen. This is not the first time we've heard about that word, recapitalization. There's an ongoing recapitalization in the banking sector at the moment. We've seen recapitalization in the insurance sector. Do we also need recapitalization in the power sector? If yes, how?
I think recapitalization at the distribution level is past long due. Past long due, because it should have happened. But recapitalization also comes with having the regulatory structures to support that recapitalization. So for instance, if you're recapitalizing, you're going to be investing in assets. That assets, the cost of those assets need to be recovered eventually. So when you then say go recapitalize, and you're not recognizing that cost of recapitalization of the assets on that recapitalization will be passed on to the cost of service, in other words, tariff, you're pretty much stranding capital or making it very difficult to have capital access. So I would expect, again, go recapitalize. There has to be business. For instance, the CBN says, banks, go recapitalize because we want you to trade in certain areas or do certain things we want to improve. Want you to, maybe your NPLs, that kind of, there are certain areas that is to go and recapitalize because we see certain things in your books where capital is needed. In this instance, right, for discos, if you tell them to recapitalize, you also need, they need to show you where they're going to put that capital. And that capital, where they put it, needs to be able to improve service. And where service is improved, there has to be a cost that reflects the cost of that capital. Now, one of the things I liked about Bank A was that it then set a benchmark for where tariffs should really be. Right? So one of the things I kind of was hoping was that this goes, okay, band A, my band E, band D feeders, I'm actually going to borrow against it. I'm actually going to raise capital to step up these band D, band E feeders to band A.
So which is my point. So for a lot of these discos, if you also look at some of the reports published by NERC, a lot of them are actually technically insolvent. And so if you have a company that is technically insolvent, so capital coming in is not necessarily coming in at least at some point to purchase new assets. It's coming in to effectively repay existing creditors.
If that is a capital recapitalization, then it's dead on arrival. Because the hole is big.
So that's my point. So how do they get past this? Because at some point, you have to fix that, right?
But let's ask yourself this. And I mean, I start...
Because a lot of these banks that may have unlent or lent money to some of these discos, some of this money that is being owed is also owed to the government. How do you fix that whole mess? How do you go from there to this new chapter that you've been talking about? How do you do that?
So let me quickly address the debt issue that seems to be one of the challenges discos have. The question I ask is, how many banks have actually lent to the discos as opposed to core investors? If we're talking of core investor loan, it is not a disco loan. And I've made this point.
Correct. That's clear.
It is
That's
not
clear.
a disco loan.
Yeah.
And I know the biggest challenge banks have, is that they lend to the core investor entities to buy equity and they're not seeing returns. So some of them seem to have like a direct agreement where they've been able to claim against the utility. But that is not money that went into the business. Right? The bulk of the debt that discos owe are to embeds and markets.
Exactly. So what happens now?
And that is the easiest part because it's currently sitting with the government.
Yeah.
On embed's balance sheet. Yeah. Unfortunately, Gencos are the ones bearing it, but it's sitting on somewhere. And so right now, if you were to strip away the core investor liabilities on the discos, I would expect any capital raised by the disco this time should be focused on addressing certain service delivery issues.
No. So you made it clear now. You said a lot of the debt that the discos are owing. Let's forget about the debt that their core investors are owing. The debt that the discos are owing is mostly to embed, which I agree, right? Which to embed and of course to the Gencos as well. So that debt needs to be paid at some point. So if it's not paid from the capital that discos raise, are we suggesting now that perhaps maybe it's about time government writes that debt off?
Government is not writing the debt off, but government can be creative about how that debt is paid. Again, this goes all to government entities, embeds and the market operator. I think the market operator has taken very strong steps to make sure they don't even acquire. So embeds is where the bulk of the debt, and embeds is a federal government entity. And whether we like it or not, if discos don't recapitalize for their operations, in other words, don't recapitalize to pay your embed facility, recapitalize to say, invest in your asset. Because that exactly, I remember when you asked me what has gone wrong in this sector, and I mentioned number 2 was absence of capital. That is still plaguing the sector today, at least on the distribution side. So if we were going to have a regulated capital raising process, then it will be very clear what that capital should be used for, which is put that capital in behind certain assets, which I would allow you recover based on tariff. And like I said, Band A solves this problem. Because if you invest in a feeder or a couple of feeders where they're maybe in Band E, D, Band B, whatever, and you're going to do the restringing of the lines or strengthening the lines, putting in the meters, people will understand because they know, hang on, there is cash flow to support this. We're no longer constrained by tariff because tariff is appropriately priced at Band A. But we're not seeing that. And that also talks to my point of discos reimagining their business. In fairness, some discos have started doing this very quietly.
Doing what exactly?
Taking some areas and trying to secure capital against those feeders. Very quietly, they're doing it. I can tell you that for free. The regulator may not be aware, but they're doing it because now they see the incentive to say, okay, this line has a number of companies that I know I can sell the power to. So we're going to strengthen that feeder. We're going to meter that, whatever. We can use our existing cash flow or we can borrow against through creative finance. And some discos are doing it. So let me not sit here and say it's not, nobody's thinking of that. It's happening. But we now need to encourage more of it. Because for areas that are, so long as the area is not rural, if it's urban or peri-urban and you see opportunities, I would say your natural inclination is to quickly see how you can push that feeder to band A.
Do you see discos listing at some point?
The first disco that will list, right, will have serious market opportunities. But I would say if a disco were to list, it would be hard. I would prefer if they listed SPVs.
Oh, I see.
Of certain areas. You can create SPVs and list those SPVs. I like, people need to be creative in this market. Any disco that goes to the market, maybe, let me backtrack. There are maybe 1, 2, 3 discos, if they listed, they'll still get value. Even at that.
But how can they list with the kind of capital structure they have at the moment?
So the great thing about the equities market is you can always discuss with the regulators of the equity sector, certain forbearance, certain allowance. I'm sure they would allow certain things because at the end of the day, the fundamentals are still strong in the disco business, regardless of how technically bankrupt they are or not. The fundamentals are still strong. But to make sure you go to the market with the right structure, discos need to start to corporatize some of their business units and spin that off. That can work. That if you take it to either the debt capital market or equity capital market, they will raise funding. I always say this. If Ikeja said, look, I'm going to do Ikeja GRA SPV, and I'm going to take it to the capital markets. Me, I will put money there. Because it's infrastructure, it's long
and then
term.
The path to capital is...
I know a lot of infrastructure funds that are looking for long-term investments they want to make.
Yeah.
Corporatize that SPV. You would see the money's coming. I don't know why it's such it's so hard to understand this. And I'm just looking at, there are some feeders that are so viable that if you were to spin off, corporatize that feeder, you raise the capital that disco is looking for.
Yeah.
I don't understand. But meanwhile, as discos are struggling,
I think it's probably a lot more.
Accelerators and co, they're taking their market share.
It's probably a lot more complicated than that. I do know that a number of discos have tried that. I recall when I was still there, a lot of these things were discussed, and part of the problems were all regulatory because at the end of the day, a lot of the cash flows were tied to the market, so you can't hive off some areas because if you hive off those areas, then it means who has the first right to the cash flow from those. These are all issues, but I think that suggestion makes a lot of sense. We're almost done, but 2 questions I really want us to touch on before we leave. The first is tariffs. So you did mention band A tariffs at a certain level now, which is ideally where, gives an idea of where we think tariff can be. Is that the ceiling? Do you think that the sector can still stomach higher tariffs beyond that current band A price?
Why do you want to raise tariff when the majority of your customers are in lower tariff classes? Why do you want to raise tariff for people that are already paying above market rate tariff? When the bulk of people who need reliable power are under-tariffed, so to speak.
Yeah.
So the issue is not about increasing band A tariffs. The issue is about how much of band B, band C customers can you bump up and provide the service? Because it's easy to bump people up and not provide the service. I was on band A for a while, for 4 months, and we had band D power.
Wow.
It was frustrating because you think you're saving on diesel costs only to realize that you've actually doubled your diesel costs and your grid costs is still as high as possible. So I would not say don't bump people or don't bump feeders up because you just want to make the revenues provide the service. But I don't think where band A tariff is appropriately priced.
So we shouldn't increase band A tariffs.
If there's macroeconomic issues are unfavorable, then it should reflect. But the point is macroeconomic issues, inflation, FX, fuel pricing, whatever. Band A is just appropriate where it is to also incentivize the utilities to make investments in lower class tariffs. So it is not about how do we take band A up. It's about how do we even gradually move band B tariff up. Even if you move band B from the 78 to 100 to reflect those change, it will work. Band Z, if you moved it another maybe 10%, 5%.
So the focus should be on
moving these guys up, doing what you need to do.
rather than seeing more Band A's drop.
Because you're going to kill the market if you now put all your load on Band A.
Yeah.
Move, first of all, what needs to happen first is the lower pass tariffs, wherever their service quality is now, there has to be a general tariff increase. I know people who like me saying this, but it's a reality, right? And then you then need to give timelines for utilities to move this. The idea is everybody should be on Band A, but if you don't set up very clear timelines where a Band D customer is moving to Band C or even Band A.
I thought there were timelines though.
I don't know about I've never heard about it, but I would expect that the market now is no longer in next hand. So I would expect that state electricity company or state utilities or state regulators will design a market framework that allows service delivery or allows discos move people as quickly as possible to Band A with the right service. Right. So hopefully that will happen. But like I said, the idea is not about increasing Band A tariffs. It's about how do you do a general tariff increase that increases tariff and then what's the timeline to move people to that service level of Band A so that everybody's made whole. If you don't do that.
Last question. Everybody wants 24/7 power for Nigeria. Is that achievable in our lifetime?
For Nigeria, no. A lot of communities or towns in Nigeria, yes. I say this on two counts, right? Nigeria is vast, right? So the access to power, the challenges to access to power in Borno is perhaps difficult in Bayelsa, different terrains, geography, and all that, right? But you're going to find out very quickly that there are a lot of communities that will have 24-hour power very quickly. As we speak, people in Bonny, I'm sure they don't experience power cuts. They have 24-hour power. They've had it since. Small town. A number of communities also have that. But one thing I know is that access to electricity will improve very quickly over the next 10 years. But say in our lifetime, we're going to have in Nigeria where everybody has 24-hour power. I hate to be pessimistic, but
so how come they've been able to achieve that in other countries and we can't? Like,
have they really achieved in other countries?
I mean,
Ghana has 80%, 90%.
I'm looking at Western countries, basically.
No, that's Western country. Can we talk about?
I know I said last, but it would be a disservice if I don't ask you this question, particularly for those interested in renewables. We've seen a lot of renewable companies pop up, a lot of progress in that space. I still remember how expensive it was 5-6 years ago, and compared to now, it appears that a lot of these things are slightly affordable. Where do you see renewable going? Do you think at the rates we're going, we could one day not need discos?
As I speak to you now, right, renewable energy companies are the biggest disruptors to the utility companies as currently structured, because you then have, as prices are going down in terms of renewable solar panels and coal, you then have a lot of more adopters. People, for the Band A customers, the reason for them going renewable is to blend their tariffs, reduce their Band A costs. And you've seen a lot of customers do that in the Band A area. For the lower band tariff, they just want power. So at some point, it's natural. I mean, in mature markets like the US, there's a fair amount of renewable rooftop and residential renewable entities, solutions. People are in that to reduce their tariff. The commercial CNI market is a big space. Reliability and then reducing the energy cost. So as energy prices keep increasing, the share of renewable energy in the energy mix will always continue to rise, which is why, again, it's important for discos as last mile service providers to reimagine their business. To say, okay, how do we plug into this growing risk or threat to our business? Not to counter it, but how do we plug into it? Because eventually, people have done net metering. How do we say, okay, this month you're generating 100 kilowatts. Can you sell some of it to your neighbor? I'll collect part of it. Or use my net. There are too many ways to reimagine this. But it's a big threat to utilities. Utilities just need to understand and how to plug into that model and ride on it.
All right. Thanks, Mr. Odion. It's been a pleasure and a very instructive discussion with you. Again, it wasn't an easy one, considering how experienced we both are in the sector. Well, thank you so much. I hope you guys have enjoyed Talknomics. Please, of course, we do read your comments. So please drop your comments. If you think there are questions that probably should have asked him, do let us know. And if you want to reach out to him as well, do let us know, and we'll keep you in contact with Mr. Odion. He's one of the most experienced person in the sector. I think you've heard some of his thoughts and comments as well. Of course, we do this every couple of weeks on Metrics TV. You can always go and check previous episodes of Talknomics. And of course, don't forget our flagship Drinks and Mics podcast, Follow the Money, and all the other interesting podcasts we have on Metrics TV. My name is Ugo Dre, and until we meet again next time, do have a profitable day ahead. Bye.